started today, there's a couple of questions that people usually ask us. First, is this webcast being recorded? And the answer is yes. This webcast is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the presentation within the next 24 hours. The next question we get is usually, will there be a Q&A? There definitely will be a Q&A today at the end of our presentation. It will be about 10 to 15 minutes. So you can submit questions throughout the entire webinar using the question box that's on your screen. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our presenters. And let me give you a little bit more information about them. Dave Ensing is a Vice President of MaritzCX Mobility Group, where he provides research design consultation to clients and manages our automotive studies. Dave has nearly 20 years of experience conducting and overseeing automotive customer experience programs at MaritzCX and Maritz Research. Previously, Dave held several positions, including Vice President of Voice of Customer Integration and Senior Strategic Consulting Director. Prior to joining Maritz, Dave was an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Toledo and completed his doctoral and master's degrees in psychology from Bowling Green State University and a bachelor's of arts degree in psychology from DuPont University. In his free time, Dave plays a lot of squash and runs a lot of marathons. Next, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Laurel Newman. Laurel is a behavioral scientist and member of the Behavioral Science and Innovation team at Maritz. Laurel earned her master's degree and Ph.D. in psychology from Washington University. And prior to Maritz, Laurel was a professor at Bonn University for 12 years and a chairperson of the Department of Behavioral Sciences. She enjoys gardening and cooking and kayaking. So we're excited to bring you these two impressive speakers to talk about incentive-based CX programs. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Dave. Dave?
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Today, as you can see on this slide, we're going to be talking about things to consider when you're considering adding rewards to your CX program. But actually, I think it's a little bit more than that. Even if you have rewards on your CX program right now, I think we're going to bring up some issues that you might want to think more about or realize, hey, I haven't considered that. So I think this will be informative to both people that are thinking about it and already have things in place. You might ask yourself why we're talking about this now. One trend that we've seen across businesses is much more focus on providing a great customer experience as a way to differentiate companies from their competitors. And that's particularly important in industries, and it's a lot of industries now, where products are reaching parity in both quality and features. So one of the ways that companies are trying to improve the customer experience is by rewarding or financially compensating their channel employees based off of customer experience measures. So just a little bit of a framework, when we talk about CX programs, what we're talking about basically is a company rewarding their channel partners or their end service providers based off of CX. So that may be retailers, it may be insurance agents, maybe dealerships. In my world, it's dealerships a lot, those sort of things. We'll probably use the term retailers, but it's any end channel partner. And it may sound simple to just add money to a CX program, but it's much more complex than you'd probably think. Now, the automotive industry has been doing this for decades, and MaritzCX and Maritz Inc. have been conducting a lot of these programs, both on the research side and on the reward side. So the issues and recommendations we're talking to you about today are based off of that experience and also based off of behavioral psychological research. So that brings us to our agenda. We're going to talk about four major things. We're going to talk about the need to define the purpose of your program, so knowing what you want to do with it. If you're going to reward compensation, you need to set goals for people to obtain to get the rewards, so we're going to talk about that. There are different types of rewards that are used in different levels, so that's really important. And then finally, we're going to talk about program governance, which are the processes and the rules that you put in place. And when you add compensation to that, that gets much more complicated as well. So enough intro. Now I'll turn it over to Laurel to talk about defining the purpose of the program.
Yeah, so a lot of people, when they begin with a program like this, they think about, what am I trying to reward? And then they set a budget and kind of figure out, how do I work backwards from my budget? Who should I reward and for what? But we really would encourage people to stop and think, first of all, about what the purpose is of their program. So why are you starting this program? What are you really trying to accomplish? Because the goals and the purpose of the program really should dictate a lot of the decisions that you make about things like who will be eligible for it, what will the criteria be to earn a reward, what will the reward be, and so forth. So this slide shows you some examples of some things that you might be thinking about trying to accomplish with a CX Rewards program. So on the left side, you might be interested in improving performance. So a lot of people want to reward top performers to keep them happy and satisfied and working hard. You might also have a goal to kind of move the middle. So how can we give people who are doing a pretty good job an incentive to do a really great job? Or you might be looking at motivating the bottom. So if you have people who really aren't seeming like they're trying that hard, this might incentivize people or motivate them to work harder to provide a better customer experience. But also, programs like this can serve purposes related to recognition and employee satisfaction. So you could continue rewarding current behaviors among the people who are doing things well. You can use this as a way to retain good employees. So this might be a differentiator between you and other companies that they could work for. And also, programs like this serve a communicative purpose. It tells employees that while we say that customer experience and providing the best experience possible is really important to us as a company, this shows that you're actually incentivizing and rewarding that. So you're kind of putting your money where you're saying that your values are. And we know that customers, when they come in and see that someone they're working with has won an award, that shapes the way that they perceive or interpret the experience that they have. So if someone who is serving you has an award for customer service, you're more likely to assume the best from them, and that has kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the experience tends to be better. Now, there are a couple of ways that people add these types of programs. You might just add or create a customer experience rewards program in and of itself, sort of a freestanding program. But what's more common is that you have a program or you're developing a program for all kinds of different behaviors that you want your employees to demonstrate. So it might be related to sales targets, it might be related to keeping up with trainings and other kinds of growth opportunities. It might be related to corporate citizenship, doing the right things, compliance, things like that. And customer experience is one of several things that you want people to be paying attention to and you want people to be doing. Sometimes people will use customer experience as sort of a qualifier, so you can't win an award for this rounded body of behaviors that we're incentivizing unless you have high scores in customer experience. So unless you're doing a good quality job, we're not going to reward you for quantity. Now, as I said, it's just important to think these things through because whatever budget you have and whatever your goals are, you want to really think through, like, how am I going to allocate things in a way that's going to maximize the probability that the right people are going to do the right behaviors to lead to our company's goals. So that kind of transitions us into the topic of what are the goals going to be for your program? What do people need to do in order to potentially earn a reward or recognition? And I'm going to pass it over to Dave to talk about how we would set those kinds of goals.
Great. Like I said before, you're going to need to set goals so you can determine if your program participants receive or don't receive the reward. So there's lots of characteristics about goals that we should talk about. The first thing I want to do is talk about the types of goals. So the first type of goal is the one that people think about most and comes to mind easiest, which is performance goals. And a performance goal is given if a person achieves a certain outcome, sometimes they're called outcome goals as well, and how people achieve that outcome is left up to them. Here's a little picture of me and my daughter finishing our first marathon, and I use that as an illustration of an outcome goal because my outcome goal for that was to complete the marathon and not to die, and I was successful in both of those, so that was good. Now, performance goals have a lot of advantages to them. They're easy to understand. They really focus people on that goal, and because of that level of focus, they really have strong effects. So that's the good side. But of course, there's always a bad side. And kind of the bad side of performance goals are that they can lead to a lot of score chasing, in which case the person is primarily focused on getting the score rather than, in our case, improving customer experience in order to get the score. So they may do other things other than, and we'll talk about that, other than improving customer experience to get to that score. The other thing is that outcome goals can lead to what's in the psychological literature termed extrinsically motivated behaviors. And basically that just means that I'll do this because I'm going to get something, and something from someone else or somewhere else. So things are extrinsically motivated, and then when you take away that reward, people tend to stop doing that behavior. So if you want to address both score chasing and extrinsic motivation, and you might try process goals. So process goals are goals where you reward an activity that leads to the desired goal, but you're not rewarding the outcome itself. Here I have a picture of a salesperson because a common process goal in business is rewarding somebody for making X number of sales calls per day, regardless of the outcome. In the CX world, process goals might be something like having your channel partners follow up with X number of unsatisfied customers or a certain percentage of unsatisfied customers. And the idea there is that obviously if they follow up with unsatisfied customers, they're going to resolve more of them. Your customer experience is going to go up. Another process goal typical in CX is implementing action plans where retailers will identify areas that they need to improve on, set plans for improving that, and execute those plans. And the reward is just based off of doing that activity. It's not based off of the outcome of that activity. So those are process goals. They have some advantages to them. It gets people to do what you want. And it develops good habits. And it's particularly good for people that are new to a job or new to the CX world because it tells them what you want them to do. Often it leads to more sustainable results, and it can create intrinsic motivation because people realize that, hey, if I do these things, I get to my outcome, I get to my goal, that feels good, that's success, so it leads to more intrinsic motivation. Now, it does have some cons as well. One is that you might get resistance. People might say, don't tell me how to do something, just tell me where I want to get to. And that's particularly true in people that are veterans that have been part of something for a long time. They have their own processes and things in place, so you might get resistance from them. And then the big one is there's no guarantee that you're going to achieve your outcome goal. The other characteristics that we need to talk about in terms of goal are SMART goals. And I've given entire presentations on SMART goals, so I don't have time to go into it very much here. But basically, it's just a nice acronym to think about some of the characteristics of your goals. And your goals should be specific, meaning that they should be concise, and it should state exactly what a person needs to attempt a goal. So like, improve customer experience isn't specific because you're not saying improve by how much. So you want it to be very specific. You also want it to be very measurable, so you clearly define what the measure is. And in the customer experience world, that's pretty easy to do because it's usually some sort of metric measured in customer experience, and we'll talk about that in a minute. A big one, and probably the hardest one in the CX world to configure, is that you want the goal to be attainable. So you want it to be kind of a stretch for participants, but you also want it to be reachable, because if it's not reachable, it's not motivating at all. Finally, you want it to be relevant in terms that it should be specific to the person or group that you're rewarding. For instance, if you're rewarding retailers, you could reward a salesperson based off of the overall customer experience. But there's probably a lot of things in the customer experience that the salesperson really can't affect. So a better, more relevant measure for a salesperson would be overall satisfaction with the salesperson. And then finally, you want your goal to be time-based. So you want people to know, when the goal will be awarded, what time frame they have to accomplish the goal, those sort of things. So those are SMART goals. And again, that's a very brief overview of that. There's some other characteristics, particularly in the CX world, to think about when you're talking about goals. One is, do you use a single item measure? And that might be something like overall customer satisfaction. It might be an NPS score, but it's measured by one thing. Or do you use an index? So an index is usually a mathematical either addition or weighted addition of a number of items. And one of the good things about that is that you can use 3 to 5 key performance indicators. You can make that your index. That'll focus your retailers on the index that are on the things that you want them to look at and work on. It's also a little bit harder to manipulate it because you can't ask somebody to just respond to a single item in a certain way. So an index is a nice way to do it. And you can also weight that index. So if some key performance indicators are more important than others, you can apply those weights to account for that. So generally, we recommend using an index versus a single item measure, and that index should be somewhere from 3 to 5 items. You don't want to get too much more than that because people really can't focus on improving more than 3 to 5 things at a time. The next characteristic is one all or nothing goal versus tiered goals, and this is for individuals. So do you just set one goal that the individual has to obtain and they get everything or they get nothing, or do they have different tiered goals where there are different levels of payouts? Now, the all or nothing goal is simpler, it's easier to understand, but it has some drawbacks to it. One of the big ones is that if there's an all or nothing goal, people will often, especially if there's a big reward attached or big compensation attached, people will often do things to reach that goal that they probably shouldn't do. And also, if that goal is too far from somebody, it's not very motivating because they know they'll never get there. Or even if it's real easy for them to accomplish, it's not real motivating because they don't have to do anything to accomplish the goal. So a tiered goal is probably a better way to go, where there are different levels of achievement, different reward payouts per level. That way, people on the low end, they have something to achieve. People on the high end, they have something to improve. And people don't manipulate quite as much because going from one tier to the other isn't as important. Doesn't have that big of a change in payout. Finally, what I want to talk about is one goal, and this is about groups of participants, one goal for everybody or different goals for different participants. Again, one goal for everybody is easier to administer, it's more understandable, but in a lot of cases, you will probably have your channel partners or your retail stores or whatever they are have different levels of customer satisfaction depending on what group they're in. For instance, a company might have smaller retailers who have high levels of satisfaction and larger retailers who have low levels of satisfaction, or retailers in different areas of the country or in different countries that have different levels of satisfaction. And if you only have one universal goal, again, you're going to have a goal that's almost unachievable for some and very achievable for others. It's not really fair, and there's actually been some lawsuits around that. So you got to kind of watch out for that. But generally, it's better to have different goals for different participants as long as you know that they tend to have different customer experience scores. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Laurel to talk about reward characteristics rather than goal characteristics.
Okay, so yeah, just to be clear, the goals that Dave just talked about are basically what are you asking people to do in order to potentially earn a reward. And here with reward characteristics, we're talking about what do you want to offer to people to try to incentivize them or motivate them to do the thing that you're asking and reach their goal. So oftentimes companies go straight to what's probably the easiest thing to monitor and quantify, which is cash rewards. So cash rewards are sort of easy to distribute particular values and easy to track, but there are some drawbacks to cash rewards. So, for example, research finds that when people are given cash as a reward or an incentive specifically, it activates what we call market norms, which leads to, as Dave talked about, extrinsic motivation. So I'm doing this thing, I'm working hard to please customers because I want to get this cash. And there's kind of a host of issues related to, that can come from that. So, for example, as Dave said, once you take the cash away, oftentimes people are no longer motivated. Also, it can do what's called crowding out of intrinsic motivation. So whereas maybe a lot of people are intrinsically motivated, they want the customers to be happy, when you introduce cash, their focus tends to shift to that extrinsic motivation. We also see some trouble with things like creativity and performance levels when cash is the incentive, because people tend to do only what's necessary to get the cash, and often they don't put in much extra effort on top of that, for example. With non-cash rewards, it's often interpreted by people as more like a gift, and it activates what we call social norms. So there are some benefits to this. When people receive a gift from someone, it tends to keep them focused on the purpose of doing it, which is to ultimately help the company who's giving them this gift. So it sort of activates reciprocity norms. And you also don't see that tendency to crowd out intrinsic motivation that we talked about before. So there's a whole body of research on the benefits of non-cash rewards by some academic partners of ours. So for example, a couple of the benefits. One is that people, if they earn a non-cash reward or points that they can cash in for merchandise or travel or something, they tend to treat themselves they have a lot of gratitude towards the company for allowing them to have something that they wouldn't spend their own money on. So people will say things like, I never would have gone on that trip, I never would have bought that iPad, I never would have purchased that kind of, to me, luxury item with my own money, but because I earned it for my performance, I felt justified in doing that. That's actually called justifiability. Another one is trophy value. So it's not really socially appropriate to get on Facebook and brag that you got a $500 bonus from your company, but you can get on Facebook and show that you got this new toy or this new tech gadget or something that you really like because of your performance at work, or you can post pictures of yourself on a trip or out to dinner as a thank you from your company. So people get a lot of social rewards and longer emotional rewards from non-cash versus cash rewards. There's kind of a continuum that a lot of us at Maritz are familiar with, showing cash on the far right. This is the most transactional type of reward that you can give someone. And with cash, they clearly know what the price tag is. On the left side, you see, as we move over, gift cards are kind of cash-like, but they're a little bit more personal and social because they show something about the person's unique interests, and they buy for you oftentimes an experience or a thing that you enjoy having. So there's more emotional value. Points, you can allocate or accrue points and cash those in for things that are personally important to you. Merchandise, you can either provide people with gifts that are merchandise, or you can allow them to choose from rewards catalogs and things like that. And then travel and experiences are some of the most relational gifts that you can give to people. They bring a lot of positive emotion for people over a really long period of time, and that positive emotion is associated with the company that allowed them to have that experience. The reason I have the price tag, no price tag, is because there's also research showing that when you attach a price tag, when somebody knows what something is worth as an incentive, people put in an amount of effort that's commensurate to that value. So if it isn't very much, they're not going to work very hard. We don't see that same thing when people are rewarded with gifts. It's not socially appropriate when someone gives you a gift to say this isn't worth enough, and people tend to carry that over with employer gifts as well. A couple of other features of rewards that you might be curious about are like, how much should a reward be worth? And as I said, it kind of depends on how many people you have to give rewards to and what your budget is, obviously. But as I said, it's trickier with cash because people will be influenced by the amount of cash that you're offering them, whereas when you give people non-cash things, it's a little bit less tricky. Is there such thing as too much? Not really. I mean, the larger the reward, the harder people are going to work to get it. The only concerns are things like you don't want people to a reward to be so high in value that people become dependent on it, because then it just becomes a stress for them if the reward is removed, and that's not the purpose. It's supposed to be a joy for them when they get the reward.
Yeah, this is Dave. The other thing about that is that as the reward goes up, if it gets really high, then again, people tend to do things to get the reward that you might not want them to do. They might try to manipulate the survey. They might try to do things other than just improve the customer experience because it becomes so important to them. It becomes a necessity. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, especially if they perceive the goal to be out of their reach. So when Dave talked about SMART goals and making sure that goals are kind of stretched but attainable, if a goal isn't attainable to people but the reward is really high, you do kind of set yourself up for more gaming of the system. And then how often? So the reinforcement literature finds that the closer in time of when you give the reward to when the behavior was done, the more of an association people will have between the behavior they did and the reward. So the more reinforcing it is of them doing those behaviors again in the future. So you don't want reward frames to be really long in time, but you do have to balance that with the need to collect enough valid information. So enough survey submissions, for example, that you have a reliable measure that you feel confident saying that this person has done what they need to do to earn the reward. So oftentimes quarterly is a good time frame for a lot of businesses. Some businesses do it annually. But that annually will have more of kind of a, obviously it'll be kind of a symbolic thing that's meant to reward ongoing customer service, whereas when you do it in shorter time frames, it feels more like an if-then kind of reward. So once you've made some of these decisions about what am I asking people to do to earn the reward, what kinds of rewards am I going to offer to people, you have some of the kind of skeleton built out for a program. There are also a lot of considerations, though, around how do you execute a program in a way that's going to make it as seamless as possible. So I'm going to let Dave talk about some of those governance considerations.
Thanks, Laurel. So if you add a significant reward component to your customer experience program, people are going to start to pay much, much more attention to it. And actually, that's a good thing because, sometimes you don't realize that your CX program is really kind of flying under the radar until you add a compensation component. And then all of a sudden people are asking you questions about it. They may be challenging you about it. And if there's compensation, people are going to challenge and ask questions. So that's why governance becomes really important, and the way that I define governance, at least, is the process of setting, communicating, and enforcing program rules. There's a lot of things about governance. I can't go into all of them today, but we'll hit a few. The first part of governance are qualification rules or qualification criteria. And those are things that participants must meet just to become eligible for the program. So regardless of what their outcome is, they could have great customer experience, but if they don't meet the qualification rules, they're not even part of the program. So some typical qualification rules are minimum number of surveys. So if your measure is based off of a customer experience survey, at the unit level or at whatever reward level, be it the salesperson or the dealership or the store or the bank branch or whatever, you need a certain number of minimum surveys in order to develop a reliable measure. And the general rule for that is, 100's good, 30 is pretty acceptable, and anything below that is questionable. And as Laurel mentioned, part of your decision about how often you want to give rewards depends on this minimum number. So maybe your program at the retailer level can support annual awards or rewards, but not quarterly rewards, because not enough units will have enough returns. So, 30 is good. Now, the problem is that even in large companies, like, we do surveys that have millions of returns per year, but the problem is they also have thousands of units per year that you're trying to reward, dealerships, stores, hotels, that sort of thing. And those returns aren't equally divided or equally distributed amongst all those thousands of units. So you're going to have some smaller units that probably aren't going to meet this minimum. So generally what companies do is they figure out what's the biggest number of returns that I can use where the vast majority of people will qualify, participants will qualify. The other thing they do is they have moved from a sample surveying process where you're only sampling some customers to a census where you're sampling everybody to try to get higher numbers of returns at the unit level. The next thing is quality of the sample provided. A lot of times in CX research, the actual retailers are the ones providing the sample because they know who they sold to. Now, they can manipulate the survey process by only providing sample of certain people and things like that. So you want to make sure that sample is of good quality that's provided. So two things you want to usually look at are the percentage of sample provided compared to the overall sales, and then of the sample that's provided, how much has good contact information in it. And then finally, you also might want to add compliance with other programs as a qualification rule. So that might be something like compliance with CX training programs. Are people enrolled? Are they taking the programs? Or compliance with mystery shop programs, something like that. You also need to think about survey appeals. So participants are going to challenge surveys that lower their scores. Sometimes those challenges are legitimate, like the customer experience survey was sent to the wrong customer because one customer returned the product and then it was sold to somebody else. Or the survey was actually about a type of transaction that doesn't apply to that program. Other ones we've seen are more questionable. A retailer might call and say, hey, I called the customer and he didn't mean to give me a low score. Or in the automotive world, one thing we get a lot is, hey, I couldn't get parts for the repair from the company, so it wasn't my fault, it was your fault. Why should I be penalized on this? So you need to put processes in place to say how you'll handle survey appeals and what will generally be appealable and what won't. Our advice is to limit survey appeals to egregious survey errors, like sending the survey to the wrong customer or having them rate the wrong transaction. And in cases like that dealership one that I mentioned, what you can say is that it might be true that the company didn't have parts, but other dealers are dealing with the same sort of thing, and it's all about how you communicate with the customer and how you appease the customer in that process. So that's survey appeals. Another thing that you might want to think about are mulligans. So mulligans in golf are free do-overs without a penalty shot. In CX, it is removing the bottom level, some X%, 1%, 5% of surveys from the scoring process to, quote, give participants a break. And a lot of times, that's used because people say, well, you can't please everyone, so give me some mulligans. Generally, we feel that's not a good idea. We've seen it done a lot. The reason it's not a good idea is, one, it can become a nightmare to administrate and to communicate about because something that may be a mulligan one day isn't a mulligan the next day because somebody else sent in a survey that was lower than that. So participants have trouble tracking how they're doing towards their goals with mulligans coming in and out and doing all that kind of stuff. So it can be a nightmare to administrate. It can be very confusing because if you think about it, you have to set your goals based off of, if you're doing the goal is equal to the top 30% of scores, you have to set the goals based off of not taking the mulligans out, and you have to set the performance measures with taking the mulligans out. And I know this is confusing, but if you don't do that, all you're doing is you're raising the bar. If you take the mulligans out and then compute the target score, you just raise the bar for everybody. So it gets confusing. And finally, it really doesn't reduce the number of appeals because people just don't want them to count towards their mulligans. Then you also need to guard against survey manipulation. So you need to set rules for survey-related behavior because retailers or participants are probably going to talk to the customer about the survey, and they may do things that you don't want them to do. For instance, you got to decide if something like this is acceptable. So this is a communication that we've seen sent out to customers basically saying, hey, when you get the survey, give me a passing grade, give me a completely satisfied because anything else is considered failing. We also have an email here that somebody else sent out, which basically says, I'm contacting you to make sure you're completely satisfied. You're going to be getting a survey from the company. Please rate me all 10s. And, it's very important. And by the way, if you see this last line here, P.S., I've attached a copy of the survey questions and answers that the company wants. So it even provides a sample to them. So those are the types of things that people can do. And then other things that I've seen in our experience are people saying, hey, let me fill out the survey for you, or asking people to forward the email invitation to the survey back to the retailer so they can fill it out. I've even seen subtle threatening of customers. I still remember when I was 20-something and I bought my very first car, dealer puts his arm around me and says something pretty close to the effect of, when you buy a new car, he said, first son, this is your first new car, right? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, well, let me tell you something. When you buy a new car, you have a relationship with your dealer, and you're going to be getting a survey from the company pretty soon. And all that I can say is, if you take care of me, I'll take care of you. So I process that as a little subtle threat that I better give him good scores, otherwise he wasn't going to take care of me as a customer. So those sort of things happen. You've got to be careful about that. And you need to set rules about what will happen if people do that, and you need to enforce those rules.
So Dave, can I just jump in and say, I just want to point out that the whole point of a CX program is to improve the service that your customers are getting. And if you imagine being the customer on the receiving end of any of those examples, at minimum, it makes you uncomfortable. It could have greater effects, but you're basically having the opposite effect that you want on your customers when your employees start doing things like that.
Right. And I often encourage companies to think of their CX measurement program, including what retailers and dealers do around that, as part of their customer experience. So when you're sending a CX questionnaire to somebody, that's part of your company's customer experience. It's not something totally different. Still part of the experience. And you're right, when people get a lot of these pressured things, it reduces the customer experience and puts a bad taste in people's mouth. There are also other manipulation methods that people can use that mess with the survey process itself. So one is not submitting contact information for unsatisfied customers. So if you have an unsatisfied customer, you just don't submit their contact information, and nobody's the wiser, and you don't get bad scores from them. So that's one of the reasons why you want to monitor sample quality and how much sample you're getting compared to sales or whatever you're measuring. Another one is, which is a little bit more insipidous, is submitting fake and invalid contact information for unsatisfied customers. So that is, you just, fat finger an email address so you know that the customer never really gets it, but you've submitted it. So it just goes off into never, never world. One of the things that we can look for there are our percentages of hard bounces and that sort of stuff, and if they vary from retailer to retailer. Even worse is submitting fake but valid information so that it can be intercepted. So we've often seen the same email address for numerous surveys, and if you track it down, it appears to be going to the salesperson or somebody. We've seen email domains with the business address in it, so obviously it's going there. So that can happen. You need to monitor for that. And then finally, they can just simply, and this one's really hard to catch, encourage satisfied customers to respond to the survey, or just remind them about the survey, but not do that with unsatisfied customers. So there's a lot of things that you need to keep in mind, and actually there's a lot of processes in place that you can also look for manipulation. Like, one of the things that we can do is track IP addresses of people that are hitting both the reporting site, which should be the retailers and things like that, and people filling out the surveys. And if they're the same, well, you probably have a problem there. So there's a lot of things you can do, but you need to put those processes in place. And finally, after you have all these rules and all these processes in place, you need to communicate this very clearly to the program participants. So what most programs do is they publish a manual. They also have call-in lines where people can ask and things like that, but usually have a manual that outlines everything. And some of the things you want in here are the qualification criteria. One thing I neglected to put on the slide is what the actual rewards are and what they can earn. So what are the goals and how will they be measured? So what will they be measured on to get those rewards? Specifics regarding how the scores will be calculated. Are you putting in Mulligans? Are you not putting in Mulligans? Is it an index? Is that a top box score versus a mean? All those sort of stuff. The survey appeals process. What's allowable and what's not allowable. Another thing that I don't have on here are what are the consequences of cheating. That needs to be really, I do have that on there, and what'll happen if people cheat, and then you really need to enforce those rules. So those are some of the things you want in your communication. So with that, I will pass it back over to Laurel.
All right, so I just want to summarize here to make sure that we leave some room for Q&A at the end. These are some take-home points, just a high-level overview of the things we talked about today. So adding a rewards or compensation program to your CX program can have positive or negative effects. Obviously, you want it to have positive effects on customer experience as well as on your employees. Some of the negative effects we alluded to were things like cheating. Also, employees can have resentment if they feel like the program is unfair to them. You can undermine people's intrinsic motivation to serve customers if you're not rewarding them in the right way, and things like that. To maximize the positive and minimize the negative, start with the purpose of your program in mind, as we talked about at the beginning. Make sure that you're setting goals that are SMART goals. Use an index of a few different items so that people don't adjust their behavior just to do one thing, but they're giving a more rounded customer experience. Use motivating rewards and consider the benefits of non-cash rewards, which have a lot of potential to be motivating and have more emotional lift than cash. Set governance rules carefully, and as Dave just said, clearly communicate all of this information to program participants. So transparency is a big foundational piece of trust, and people are going to trust the company and the program more when it makes more sense to them. They're also going to succeed more when it makes more sense to them, which is a win for everyone. So I know we went through this stuff pretty quickly, and you have a recording, or you will have a recording sent to you of the webinar, but we also have a lot of this information in a brief document that Dave and I co-authored, and there's a link to that document here so that you can download that and read it if you want to.
And that link will be, let me just say that link will be part of the email that's sent to you, so you can find it there.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And I think we're handing it over to Kelly here to talk about Experience Forum and Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Laurel. Thank you, Dave. This was extremely interesting. Personally, I love the SMART rewards and the information about the behavioral characteristics around cash and non-cash. So thank you very much for the insightful information. Before I go into the Q&A, I'd like to talk about an event that we're hosting in December in New York. It is an Experience Forum event for practitioners, analysts, people that work on experience management for customers, employees, or patients. This forum is again in New York, December 11th, and we have top industry experts, we have best practices and case studies, and I just want to personally invite you to attend. You can go to our website at MaritzCX.com. There is a link there, or you can go to MaritzCX.com/experience-forum-2019. Or if you're a client, you can talk to your rep, your client rep. But we'd love to have you join us. It's going to be a great event. So now with that, we will go to Q&A, and we had some questions come in. So Dave and Laurel, I'll let you decide who should take each of these questions. The first one is, are index predominantly process goals, outcome goals, or a mix of both? Who'd like to take that?
I'll take that. So this is Dave. They're kind of a mix of both, but basically, so the index, and this is going to sound weird, is kind of made up of outcomes of process goals. So like I mentioned, my world is often automotive dealerships and things like that. So an index might be made up of weighted scores for overall satisfaction with the salesperson, the delivery process, the finance process, and the facilities. So each of those things, I guess you could so those are the process things that get you to overall satisfaction, but it's an outcome goal of that. So it's the, what score did you get on each of those things? Does that make sense? Well, I guess I can't get feedback, so I hope that makes sense.
It does. It makes sense. Thanks, Dave. Hey, the next question is curious. What do you see companies do with that small portion of units that don't meet the minimum? How do they let them participate?
That is a good question. One of the ways that they do it is that they carry over their responses from, if you have a quarterly program, they carry over their responses from one quarter to the next. So they might be able to qualify based off of 2 quarters of data. And then the question is, do you award them for 1 quarter or 2 quarters? But a lot of them then reward them for 2 quarters. So you can kind of extend them out. Now, again, that becomes a bit of a nightmare to administrate, but that's probably one of the most common ways of doing it. The other way is to have a separate program for your really small units that aren't going to make that criteria.
Great, thank you, Dave. Yeah, I have one more. This might be Laurel, but it may be you. But how are sustainable changes in employee behavior driven by short-term results-oriented rewards?
I can speak to that in general. I personally don't have as much experience as Dave probably does in the CX space, so Dave, feel free to add on here. But really, it depends on the type of behavior that you're trying to drive. So oftentimes people will use rewards like small kind of periodic cash-based rewards or cash equivalent types of rewards to motivate people to do behaviors that they're not very intrinsically motivated to do to begin with. When you look at behaviors that are like more related to the person's core job performance that you would hope that they would be more intrinsically motivated to do, that's where we get into usually more sophisticated reward programs that can be more strategically developed to try to kind of boost people's effort at the right time and give them the feedback that they need on how they can improve and things like that, so that they kind of stay chugging along on the goals that they should already have for themselves. And in that case, rewards are often presented more as sort of an acknowledgement of a person's hard work and accomplishments, as opposed to like an incentive in a lot of workplace environments. Now, in sales-focused workplace environments, we do see a lot more use of if-then types of incentives. If you do this behavior, if you reach this goal, then you get this particular reward.
Great, thank you, Laurel. Another question. What advice do you have for unwinding cash rewards and transitioning to non-cash rewards?
Good question. Laurel, you want to take that, or?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question, and that is one of the difficult things that our clients kind of talk to us about. I've been giving cash, and I see there are a lot of benefits to non-cash, but people kind of expect the cash. One thing that some companies have done is just sort of grandfathered people, so they'll just say something like, you know, if you were hired before this date, this is the reward structure. If you're hired after this date, this is the new reward structure. And usually when people are coming into a job, they might feel a little bit like they're coming in at a disadvantage. But if you have rewards that people are getting, they're usually still pretty happy that they're getting rewards. And if they didn't have that cash, then they haven't come to rely on it. So it's a little bit less of an issue compared to pulling cash away from people who are already getting it. It is especially difficult if people view the cash as part of their compensation. I mean, that is one of the challenges with giving cash that we don't like, is that people come to rely on that cash for their bills and other expenses. So it can be really tricky to pull that back. That's why we recommend, if you're starting one, that you be really careful about going down that road. In terms of if you already have a cash one and you don't want to grandfather people, another way to do it is to have sort of a delay where you say, okay, starting on this date next year, like beginning of fiscal year, whatever, you can say we're going to transition to a new reward structure. And that way people have a big heads up and they kind of know that it's coming. And psychologically, people are much more concerned with what's happening right now. That's called like temporal discounting. People are more concerned with what's happening right now, and even if you tell them that future them is not going to be getting this cash, they don't get as upset as if you tell them that present them is not getting this cash, and that can give them some time to come to terms with the change and not feel like they're blindsided by it.
And Laurel, I don't know the answer to this, so I might be putting you on the spot, but have companies ever tried kind of phasing in the non-cash part? So if you have a cash program, it's like, okay, we're going to reduce the cash part of this program, but then you have the opportunity to win X, Y, and Z, and then kind of just phasing it in and phasing one in and phasing the other out. Has anybody tried that?
Yeah, I mean, some companies have tried that, and I saw another question related to have people started with performance goals and ever transition to process goals. And it's kind of a similar thing in that we don't see people ever really starting with performance goals and then switching only to process goals. Usually it's more that they're only rewarding on performance and they start shifting some of the rewards to process to encourage people to be doing the right behaviors that we know lead to the outcomes, because those process behaviors are in people's control and that makes it a more obtainable goal for them. So along the lines of cash, non-cash, yeah, it's not that we would see people typically start with cash and completely shift to non-cash full stop. I mean, some people might do that, but oftentimes people will do something like transition part of it to non-cash, and then when people see kind of the buzz that comes around the non-cash of getting the things that they like and of sifting through the rewards catalogs and going on trips, you know, you start to get more support for the non-cash rewards.
Thank you both very much for the detailed responses to those questions. We do have more questions, so if you did submit a question, Dave and Laurel will answer them after today's session. Thank you for your time, both Dave and Laurel, and for sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it today. We do want to apologize for some technical difficulties that we had in the beginning of today's webcast, but we got everything rolling after a moment. And with that, from all of us at MaritzCX, thank you for your time and have a great remainder of your day.
Yeah, thank you.